Hello, everyone. My name is David Klein. I'll be hosting this seminar on behalf of System Change, Not Climate Change, which is an eco-socialist, anti-capitalist organization. We'll post the link to our website in the chat, where you can also post your questions to our guest, Ashley Kosak. The title of her talk is Hydrogen, Fossil Fuels' Latest Hype. As a SpaceX engineer, Ashley Kosak created Project Earth, the first decarbonization effort within the company. A mechanical engineer, she is the founder of Green Arrow, spelled A-E-R-O, a climate innovation agency that has been featured in the media. She also hosts bi-weekly co-working events in the San Francisco Bay Area. Ashley most recently completed a research program manager fellowship with Frac Tracker, and she has a recent article on hydrogen entitled "The Truth About Blue Hydrogen, Green Fuel or Greenwash." So Ashley, go ahead and share your screen.
Alrighty, good morning. Thank you everyone for joining. It's always so exciting to, just like see that people have an interest in my work and interest in what I have to say about things. And so, recently I completed a fellowship with Frac Tracker Alliance, where I was a research and program manager fellow. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to learn more about hydrogen, though it was kind of a subject that I was interested in for a while. So today I'm going to be talking about the color wheel of hydrogen and how the fossil fuel industry is really kind of hiding behind these different colors as a way to allow them to pursue further infrastructure projects that have actually sort of historically already been around, have intense carbon emissions, etc. And so we're going to be getting into all of that. I just wanted to introduce myself and thank you, Dave, for the introduction. I really appreciate it. So I'm the founder of Green Arrow. We are an engineering agency, sort of climate innovation. I honestly, it goes by a couple of different names, just because I was still trying to figure out what we do per se. I wouldn't call it the most successful business, but I graduated from Rochester Institute of Technology as a mechanical engineer. And since graduating from Rochester, I also was a mission integration engineer, mostly involved in propulsion. I worked down at the launch site in Cape Canaveral, and I started Project Earth, which was an effort to get engineers within the company to take responsibility for their own carbon emissions throughout the life cycle analysis of the parts that they owned. While I was there, we gained about 30 to 40 engineers sort of on this project, volunteering, just trying to help out on this type of effort. And that was really the kickoff into how I've tried to influence the climate environment within aerospace, is the best way I could put it. So what is hydrogen? Hydrogen is the smallest atom on the periodic table, and it's also among one of the most abundant gases on the planet within our atmosphere. So within the atmosphere, we've got oxygen and nitrogen. Those are our breathing airs. And we've also got carbon, argon, hydrogen, helium, etc. And so hydrogen, as we understand it, is mostly being used within a couple of different industries. This includes chemical manufacturing. So hydrochloric acid is an example of this. It's also used to create ammonia and fuels. An example of who uses the most hydrogen is Dow Chemical, which is one of the largest chemical manufacturers within the US. They're based up in Michigan, Saginaw, Michigan, and they also, I think it's important to note, they're the cause of one of the largest chemical spills in Michigan, and it's contaminated their drinking water, it's contaminated their land. And so that sort of is addressing part of the impacts of hydrogen that it's important for us to note when we talk about the creation of hydrogen. Hydrogen can also be used in the energy industry. So renewable energy, power storage. Hydrogen can be an effective power storage mechanism because it can be stored long-term within a non-lithium ion battery. And we're going to talk about that a little bit further, but it's also used within fuel cells, and it can be also used it combusts at such a high temperature that it's really effective for it. It's an effective combustion tool And yeah, so it's used within the energy industry for renewable energies, as well as hydrogen fuel cells. So the automotive industry, you may have seen that Toyota has the Toyota Mirai. That is a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. They're mostly within California at the moment, and they're more of an emerging technology. They haven't been as widely adopted as electric vehicles, but there's a huge push from the automotive industry to incorporate that into like the types of like transportation modes that we are able to use. Hydrogen is also used as a propellant. So I just wanted to include this because it just harkens back to my past as a rocket engineer, but it's also used as a propellant for Atlas, Boeing's Delta 3 and Delta 4. It was used on SLS back in November on the Artemis mission. You may have remembered that a hydrogen leak is what caused it to get delayed several times. And I think that touches on something like pretty important about hydrogen, which is that it is such a small molecule that it's very subject to leaking. And we're going to talk about that a little bit further. But let's talk about hydrogen as far as like this rainbow of colors goes. So hydrogen can be created in quite a few different ways, through coal gasification, which is black hydrogen, methane steam reformation, which is gray hydrogen, renewable power, which is green hydrogen, gray hydrogen. So basically this methane steam reformation plus a carbon capture and storage mechanism is what creates blue hydrogen, which is really the focus of today. We also have methane pyrolysis. It's called teal, but honestly, I would say that that's pretty much gray hydrogen. The reason why it gets branded as teal is because the fuel industry markets it as being a natural gas fuel. So instead of just like any fracked, I guess like that's part of like the greenwashing of it is that, oh, well, it's not methane steam reformation, it's not gray hydrogen because we're using natural gas, but at the end of the day, it is still the same source, it's the same type of input feedstock. And so that's why, to me, methane pyrolysis honestly falls more within the gray spectrum, but within the industry, it's getting branded as teal. Hydrogen can also be produced using nuclear power, and it is also naturally occurring. So that's sort of the overview of the different colors of hydrogen and how these colors are used to discuss these like large processes that it undergoes in order to get created and then used further in the industry. And there's been a lot of media buzz around it too. So this is just a couple of examples that I was able to find, but I think why I want to point this out is because we are really seeing the industry push to make green hydrogen and blue hydrogen sort of like this new, exciting, disruptive thing. And we have seen that so many times within the startup world. We've seen so many ways where these companies, they are looking for the new thing that's going to save everything. And they brand it as being like the new green solution. When honestly, when they talk about these green solutions, they're kind of actually talking about blue hydrogen. That is the problem. That is the issue, is that we're saying green hydrogen, but when you look at how much greenhouse gas is coming from the process of creating hydrogen, we can actually see that in some cases, it actually gets worse than gray hydrogen. And so this image, it comes from Robert Howarth over in Cornell, who has done a lot of speaking about blue hydrogen and is the person who kind of kicked off what, I guess, like how I began to understand what blue hydrogen and green hydrogen was because of this life cycle analysis. And so when you look at this graph, what you can see is that for gray hydrogen, so you're seeing 150 grams of CO2 per megajoule that is created, but this is like part carbon and part methane. And methane, as far as like its carbon impact on our atmosphere, it has between 50 to 100 times more impact than just the same amount of carbon. So we start with gray hydrogen, we see it's got 150. And while blue hydrogen slightly lowers that like total amount of footprint from the like unit heat energy, it actually creates more methane because this process requires methane as an input feedstock, as well as the heating mechanism to get this all turned into like, I guess, like the heating mechanism that energizes this whole system. And so you end up with more methane put into this process, and it actually has a worser impact on the atmosphere as compared to if we just stuck with natural gas, which I guess is just, to me, quite terrifying, is that we're able to see this greenwashing sort of allow these large companies to get away with this, like, oh, it's going to be greener, it's going to be better, but it's actually just a continuation of what we've been doing, and it has even a worser impact, but it's still being supported, it's still being pushed, and so that's why we need to talk about it. So this is a bit of an overview about the hydrogen production process. Basically, going into this process, you've got a water molecule and a methane molecule. These are going to be combined into a steam reformation chamber. And I guess like some people might know like the stoichiometric sort of like ratios that go into this, but having that perfect mixture of the water molecule and the methane molecule, and then heating them up to the right combustion chamber allows these molecules to start to break down and then reform as a hydrogen. And so that's what we start to see, is that as this process continues, carbon and oxygen are combined and they go through the smokestack, while hydrogen is able to go into the storage mechanism and then go on to the rest of its process. And so gray hydrogen, this is the overview of the gray hydrogen process, is that you've got your water in, you've got methane going in, you also have water going in. I think I said that, sorry, it's early here. And then carbon goes out of the stack. And what makes gray hydrogen different than blue hydrogen is that in gray hydrogen, this carbon is allowed to just release into the atmosphere. But with blue hydrogen, the carbon within the stack is supposedly supposed to be captured. And so that carbon capture and storage is what is driving the blue hydrogen movement. And I think it's important to note that like it is a valiant effort to think that we should be capturing carbon, but it's not a proven technology. It's not a proven technology. It's not a reliable technology. And what we're seeing is that hydrogen production is being supported and invested in for this technology that isn't necessarily proven. And so we can't determine if it's scalable. And what we're going to do is we're going to spend all this time and energy on the R&D and release all this carbon going into this process when we don't know if carbon capture and storage is even viable. We don't know long-term how it's going to affect people. So within hydrogen production, there's a few different ways that it gets created. And I wanted to talk about these because it sort of shows like which parties have the biggest interest in hydrogen being successful. So for gray hydrogen, steam reformation is one of the options for how that production process actually is executed on. This is an example of a reformation reactor by Lind Energy. And with this, I think what I want to point out is that the United States produces over 10 million tons of hydrogen per year using this system. It is 65 to 75% efficient, and it uses natural gas. And the groups who have the most or the largest companies around steam reformation for hydrogen are CBI, Chevron, and DuPont. And so we're seeing like all this interest in like, oh, hydrogen's going to be the next thing. Hydrogen's going to be the next thing. And it makes you wonder, well, who is backing something like this? And who are the parties that have the most interest in this being successful? And it's really easy to just look straight to these oil and gas companies that have already been using steam reformation, coal gasification, methane pyrolysis. These companies have been doing these processes for quite some time. So what they're suggesting for the most part is to include a carbon capture and storage mechanism in these processes. And I want to point out how scary this is, because there aren't very reliable ways for us to understand how much carbon is being captured by these processes. And there aren't any regulations ensuring that these processes have end of life, sort of like retirement for the carbon credits that they're going to generate from it. We don't know if injecting carbon capture and storage, if we inject that into the ground, what happens during an earthquake? What happens if it just gets, if there's like a crack in the pipe and it releases? Like, we don't know the full effects and potential failure modes for this technology well enough for us to see it as like a totally safe option for carbon capture and storage. Another option for hydrogen production, this is for black hydrogen, is coal gasification. The Kemper project was actually the first blue hydrogen project. It started with coal gasification, but then it would include carbon capture and sequestration. It started in earnest in I want to say 2015. It may have been a couple of years earlier. And it was demolished in 2017. And so I think that goes to show that we are still quite a ways out from this like blue hydrogen technology even being a viable business source. It was even just setbacks in how this plant was able to produce and like the leak paths that had been created from this work that took this company down. And the largest groups who own coal gasification plants are GE, Shell, and McDermott. Again, major players within the oil and gas industry. So now we're looking at, okay, so we've got Shell, we've got GE, we've got Chevron, and we have a lot of funding going towards hydrogen within the new IRA bill. And so to me, what this looks like is that the oil and gas industry is greenwashing hydrogen so they can increase the amount of capital investment that they get from tax cuts, that they get from new legislation that is supposed to be built around climate, but is actually supporting the same companies that have put us into this position. And that's quite terrifying. And I wanted to give a quick shout out to renewable power. There are a few different sort of like mindsets around this subject because on one hand, it's renewable, so we know at least that it is truly green. We can accept that that is a green technology, but the efficiency of setting up an entire solar panel plant so that you can create hydrogen, so that hydrogen can be used in sort of fuel cells, wherever it's going to get used, it's sort of like diminishing returns. Like, why take this energy source and convert it into a new energy source and then use that energy source to like put it into like a different, like sort of this different like mechanism to use it. However, the biggest lesson that I've gotten from learning more about hydrogen is how reliable it really can be as a renewable power storage source. Because in the past, it's mostly been using batteries and it doesn't have like the most instantaneous demand. But with hydrogen, because it's a gas that can be used through these fuel cells, it is sort of an instantaneous demand solution for power storage, for renewable power. And so there are a couple of different companies out there that are working towards green hydrogen solutions. And on one hand, I don't think that we should, as a scientific community, like we should not be saying that like hydrogen should disrupt the industry or should become like a major player within like what energy sources we get. But I do think we should consider it as a important tool for some of the problems that we've encountered, such as power storage for renewable power. And so I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that, at least because there are a couple of benefits. And yeah, I think I don't want to get into like sort of the trap of like all or nothing thinking. Hydrogen can be one of those things where it can be a lot of bad things, but it can also be some good things. It is a zero emission source, especially when it comes from a renewable power. But when we allow it to get greenwashed, and the concept of like, oh, it's going to be so green, but it's actually just like producing way more carbon than or methane than it used to. It's important to acknowledge that when we can and address it and push for change in it. So once hydrogen is made, where does it go? How do we get it transported? So within California, SoCalGas and SDG&E, they have submitted blending proposals for up to 20% of hydrogen to be mixed in the natural gas pipelines for combustion. Their basis behind this is that it's going to make it more efficient, it's going to make it more green, but in reality, what happens is because this blend of hydrogen is so different than the combustion characteristics that we have seen for just natural gas, it's going to change a significant amount of infrastructure. It's going to change what appliances you can use in your kitchen. Like those appliances need to be retrofit to allow for hydrogen. And the same thing for New Fortress Energy out in Ohio. These are just a couple of examples of the upcoming hydrogen projects, but they are building a new gas turbine plant. And this also is creating a 15 to 20% blend of hydrogen and natural gas. And so this begs the question, like, what are the further impacts that this could have? Like, in what ways does this trickle into sort of new things that we don't know about? Well, In July of 2022, the California Public Utilities Commission actually determined that blending more than 5% of hydrogen in gas pipelines overall results in a greater chance of that pipeline leaking or embrittling. Basically, the hydrogen atom is so tiny that it is able to slip through some of the grain structure of a pipe or a plastic pipe, especially since plastic is a porous material. It's going to allow for this hydrogen to seep in, and this can cause it to start to crack. It can make it weaker. And then over time, we're going to see more issues with these gas pipelines. And if those start cracking, now we need to invest more into infrastructure. We need to replace those pipelines. There's a chance that the methane also leaks further into the atmosphere. And so there's like an entire sort of like failure mode that just it accumulates and just causes like a way bigger issue than the one that we're trying to solve. And I think it's also important to note that hydrogen being such a small atom, when we inject it into gas pipelines, we currently, as methane using people within this society, we don't have the best grasp on how methane is leaking across all these pipelines. And hydrogen, it wants to leak even harder. That's what we saw in the SLS mission, was that hydrogen was leaking past all of the very specific fittings and like tubing that was existent in that like propulsion system. And it's because those atoms are so tiny that any sealing surface, it needs to be completely perfect in order to prevent any leak paths from developing for hydrogen. So even just like the smallest scratch on that surface, that's going to prevent leaking from those fittings. And how do we even detect it? Like, how do you detect it on such a broad scale? Do you do it manually or do you use pressure? Like, there are so many questions that we just haven't answered yet, but we're still sort of moving full speed ahead towards it. The industry is pushing for hydrogen, and as a result, it's allowed hydrogen to receive $8 billion in funding for new hydrogen hubs, $3 billion for ultra efficient vehicles. So this would be hydrogen fuel cell vehicles like Toyota, $55.1 billion in loans for companies building new auto facilities, and $5 billion to replace the existing energy infrastructure through the IRA. And this total sum of billions and billions of dollars is to create a technology that actually ends up releasing more methane than the current industrial uses. And it's not going towards renewable energies, which is just terrifying. Like, even if hydrogen can be a wonderful solution for renewable power storage, so much of the funding that exists within this bill is not going towards that. It is going towards the groups who have historically already had control over the methane industry, have been huge players within oil and gas. They're receiving more money for hydrogen instead of the groups who are working towards like truly green solutions. And so my recommendation is really advocate to reduce blending of hydrogen for hydrogen that's already in production. I think that this is the most important safety thing that we could do, is try to prevent this before it actually gets worse. We can also correct the record and make it known that blue hydrogen is not sustainable. It is greenwashing. It is worse than the already industrial production methods that exist. But also, I think it's important that we also support renewables, even if it's not the most ideal solution, not the most perfect one. Supporting truly green initiatives where we can it's going to help us all, I think. There are several innovative companies that I've seen that are currently working towards renewable hydrogen sources, and they're still in the very early stages. I don't expect them to be scaling up for at least a couple of years, but I think what they're doing is quite valiant compared to what the oil and gas industry is doing. And so I think it's important that we try to support the people who are on this similar mission as us, even if we can't always understand it. And so, that's sort of my talk on hydrogen. I'm happy to answer any questions. This research was supported by Frac Tracker Alliance, who allowed me to take this on as my research project, and then SoCal 350, who allowed me to speak about this at Eco Justice Radio. And if you want to reach out, if you've got any questions, or if you're interested in working together, my email is ash@greenarrow.org. I do speaking engagements. I'm working on a climate curriculum right now. And overall, we're a land remediation company using plants to remove hydrocarbons from the soil. So I'll let you guys ask any questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ashley. That's very interesting. So there are a few questions that have come through. One of them has to do with the use of hydrogen as a jet fuel. as opposed to propeller airplanes. Could you talk about the viability of that and also address in that context the dangers of nitrogen oxide emissions with the burning of hydrogen? Could that be somewhat mitigated if at high altitudes, say in the tropopause?
The impacts of nitrous oxide, I can't necessarily speak to. It's not my expertise, though I did design a rocket engine around it once, but I just don't know the climate impacts, unfortunately. So, but as far as
it's just to clarify, it's not a greenhouse gas, but it's part of smog. It burns your throat and burns your eyes. It's kind of nasty stuff, which is a product of burning hydrogen in air as opposed to burning it in pure oxygen.
I hear you on that, but that's quite new to me, unfortunately. As far as hydrogen as a climate-friendly alternative to jet fuel, yeah, I mean, it can be producible, but I think the issue is that the current production methods do truly support gray and like black hydrogen production. And so if we start to move towards that as a jet fuel alternative, we're kind of still feeding into the same industry that has been feeding jet fuels to start. It does have benefits in that the emissions of it are like clean at the end of it, but I would say, like, make no mistake that there are emissions up front in the creation of hydrogen. You have not eliminated all of the emissions just by switching to hydrogen. You've just moved where those emissions, where that impact is produced into the world.
Okay, let's see. Another question is non-combustion gasification of municipal solid waste is now being proposed in Contra Costa County. What do you think about this method?
It seems like this is creating natural gas, sort of like biodiesel in a way. It's an inefficient solution, kind of focusing on not the problem. Like, the problem really is how we allow carbon dioxide and methane to like escape into our atmosphere. In implementing gas capture, like non-combustion gasification, like things that are going to like capture all that methane coming from municipal waste storage, to me, it seems like it's not making as big of an impact as is necessary. It's not reducing emissions. It's just sort of, it's moving where they are used. Like, those emissions from the solid waste, they're still going to be used to create hydrogen. That carbon's still going to go into the atmosphere. So what we need to focus more on is not necessarily like the source, but it's the overall like mitigation of that natural gas production. Yeah, I hope that answers that question.
So there was a question on system change. So let me formulate it this way. This organization, System Change, Not Climate Change, recognizes a fundamental contradiction between the finiteness of the planetary biosphere on the one hand and the grow or die imperative of capitalism. In other words, infinite growth on a finite planet is impossible. It could also be pointed out that capitalism imposes a severe restraint on any mitigation project. Namely, it must be profitable to private individuals. So System Change, Not Climate Change, therefore advocates eco-socialism as a replacement to capitalism. What do you see as the effects of global capitalism on the climate crisis?
Capitalism, it has taken what is this like valiant effort by so many people to solve the like current crisis that we're in, and it's made them think about, how can I make money off of this? And it's quite terrifying. I mean, like, so I've been starting my own company, and at first I wanted it to be a startup. And the more I explored that sort of like VC world, the more I recognized that like they, even within like the climate VC world, and like people who want to be green, their mindset around it is still so focused on consumption and expansion and scaling. And they're just like, they want millions and millions of users, millions and millions of acres of land. They want to do as large as possible of a project so that they can show that it's scalable. I guess it terrifies me because like, that is the antithesis of like what is necessary. We need to reduce our consumption. We need to reduce our expansion mindset. But those are the only things that also get funded by these groups. And this is like the main source of like innovation that we're seeing within our country. So reconciling that difference between like all of these clean tech companies, they want to show that they're green, but in order for them to do that, they need to show that they can expand to as large of a company as possible. The two don't really they don't match up. The math isn't mathing. And it has frustrated me for well over a year now, where making money is important because it allows people to live. But we have made that the main focus of how we can fight climate change. And that was never supposed to be the focus. And so I guess it's really upsetting to me that climate solutions have become a business model for the VC world, when in reality, it's kind of like, it hasn't necessarily been effective as like a full like climate change solution. Like it has been, because solar energy and wind energy, like those have been able to expand. But I think it's putting the wrong message into the work that we're all trying to do. The way that we approach that system needs to be changed. We need to think about it from like that full scale impact concept, not just the financial benefits that we can see from climate solutions.
So one questioner formulated kind of a similar question, but more narrowly. She asked, behind the terrible companies named are even more terrible financial institutions pushing these poorly thought through projects. How can we, the people, intervene in this potential death spiral?
I mean, I do think it starts with like awareness. Before I started to research more into hydrogen, I didn't really know what blue hydrogen or like green hydrogen, like I didn't know what the difference was between the two. So if we're able to like call it out and address it when we see it on the spot versus like just accepting, oh, okay, it's that color hydrogen, like we're gonna move forward with it, I think that can be an effective system for change. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything more than that. I'm not too sure, if I'm being frank.
Yeah, it's a pretty big question.
I'm kind of a small person right now.
Could you tell us more about your company, Green Arrow, and also your biweekly co-working events in the San Francisco Bay Area? And how did you get interested in this field? Maybe you could add that as well.
Yeah, so Green Arrow, I started out with creating this company because I wanted to make renewable rocket fuel. Basically, like my concept was like, let's take industrial hemp and break that down and then use that broken down sort of like the sugar molecules from the cellulose that goes into it. Let's use that to turn it into a rocket fuel, and then we can have a carbon neutral rocket fuel for the space industry. But I, have had to shift my tune on that quite a bit, mostly because at the start, as I like dove deeper into trying to understand that process, I realized that it was going to require millions of acres of land to do something like that. And it wasn't going to be cost effective. Like the price that people pay for fuel is just so low that like I couldn't find a way to like break even on it. And that expansive mindset to me was just like so contrary to what I think was like an effective climate solution, that I just to me, like I didn't see a way through that. And honestly, I was still so like young and new, and I am still so young and new that I wasn't really sure what I was doing. But now what Green Arrow is it is my extension arm, basically, for like, I do a lot of climate projects and I want to keep working on them, and I want to keep working with individuals who are working on them. And so Green Arrow is like my agency that allows me to do that, and also have scientists and team members who are able to help. So we've got a geospatial mapping expert, we've got a land remediation expert. Basically, like what we are doing is we're taking on individual contracts with either small businesses or like private entities, private individuals, to help them with remediation projects or mapping projects. And this allows us to get our work done too. For the climate co-working, this happens out here in San Francisco. I try to have them every other Thursday. I mostly have a group chat running for them right now. So if you're interested, feel free to email me and I'll get you into like that invite. And it's sort of like, sometimes this work can be isolating, especially if you're working on it alone in your own house and you're just like typing. You're like, oh my gosh, I don't know what's going to happen. And then like, all you can kind of do is just like go back to typing or like watch TV. And so this was my way of just like trying to get other people who are working on solutions sitting together and like working together, whether that be working together on like a project or even just like talking through the problems. This was my way to like create a bit more community around it.
Okay, so there's a question about how green is green hydrogen. So let me add a little bit to that. So can you comment on how hydrogen is actually an indirect greenhouse gas in terms of, the leakage? Also, let's see what else. Oh yeah, What about the loss of efficiency in converting, hydrogen from electrolysis and then back to electricity? Is that something like a 30% loss of energy or something along those lines?
I don't have good answers to either of those. And this is actually the first time I'm hearing that hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas, but it makes sense. It is so abundant in our atmosphere. But yeah, I think like when I think of hydrogen being created and then like converted into an energy source and then converted into like another energy source, like it's sort of the same thing as like let's say like you scan a photo and then like you take that scanned photo and you like put it back on the printer, you like scan it again, you like keep doing that and like you're kind of like deep frying it. Like that's sort of like, to me, that's almost like we're seeing like a loss in like the quality of like the solution through all these different conversions. Like you're losing so much energy that if there's a way for that energy that was produced by like green hydrogen or solar renewable sources, if there's a way for that to plug directly into the grid and just, keep moving as electricity, that is a much more efficient and like valid use of that energy than trying to store it as a hydrogen. But, I think like the reason why I bring up supporting green hydrogen is because we need the tools that we can get. Like we do need all the tools that we can get, and hydrogen is an effective way to store renewable energies. And so we shouldn't discount that as a tool, even if it is not the most optimal solution. It is part of a solution, and maybe we can optimize on that. So yeah, that's my thoughts on it. I wish I knew more answers to all of the questions that were sort of like packaged into that, but unfortunately I don't.
Oh, that's okay. So Ted asks, just a few days ago, a public radio station reported that hydrogen has the potential to be a limitless source of green energy, quote unquote. What do you make of such a claim? Is hydrogen a source or merely an intermediate storage and transmission medium and largely inefficient at that? Well, I guess you kind of answered that, but if you want to add a few words.
Yeah. It's bold to say it's a limited source or an unlimited source. Like the components that go into creating hydrogen, which are like water and methane, like that methane still needs to be supplied from somewhere. Like that is not limitless. And so I think the reason why they feel that they can make that claim is because like hydrogen is so abundant in our atmosphere that like it could be found anywhere. It's like it's one of the most common elements on the planet. But that's like not, I guess that's like not looking at the process from like what is actually being done. It's taking like broad statements and applying them to like things that don't actually apply. You can't just pull hydrogen from the atmosphere and put it into a thing. It can't be limitless in that way. It needs to be produced and it's going to have carbon impacts as a result. So if we say that like it's limitless, we're kind of trying to paper over the fact that there are emissions that we need to address. And so, yeah, I think the reason why they make that claim is because of its abundance in the atmosphere and hydrogen is a source of, or merely, I think it's more of an intermediate storage and transmission medium. It's like a chemical element that we can use, but yeah, like I said, like it's not just being like extracted from anything specific. It's not a natural occurring resource that we can just like pull. It needs to be manufactured, and we've created systems that can do that, but they do create all those emissions. And so that's why it's important to recognize those.
Okay, let's see. So another question says Southeastern utilities, including Duke Energy, Southern Company, and Dominion Energy, have formed a coalition to attract one of the hydrogen hubs to the Southeast. In California, the governor, Gavin Newsom, has orchestrated a grand coalition of fossil fuel companies, government bodies, and even the University of California to fight for a hydrogen hub in the Los Angeles area. You may have heard of the Scattergood project. A number of states in the upper Midwest are collaborating as well. Hydrogen lobbyists are crawling around the state capitals in the hunt for taxpayer money. How are groups organizing to stop the hydrogen gold rush? Are there optimistic signs?
I haven't really seen a broad organizing effort towards hydrogen, but I do agree that it seems like a gold rush right now, especially with the amount of funding that was made available through the IRA. Like, people are truly running towards hydrogen right now. And I'm like sort of wondering if the lack of education around life cycle analysis and how available we've made that type of information. A hydrogen hub is a production location, similar to like the steam reformation plant or the coal gasification plant, methane pyrolyzation. Those are all considered like hubs for how hydrogen is made. But yeah, no, I haven't seen any large efforts to actually stop hydrogen. I think it's still to me it's still kind of difficult to like determine like what are the things that we need to stop, because these hydrogen hubs are still for blue hydrogen, they're still like slowly popping up. Like, they have not been fully completed yet. We're not seeing them in like full-blown production scale usage. So it's I think it's difficult. It's even for like someone who's been like trying to research it for so long, like it's difficult for me to see like, okay, well, if we made this regulation, how will this affect all of the hydrogen hubs? How do we reduce them? Or how do we at least like make them less carbon intensive? I'm not too sure. So
in the middle of your question, somebody asked, well, what is a hydrogen hub?
Oh yeah, I talked about that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
It's sort of summarizing some of your talk. What I think I see is that the gas companies are trying to stay alive. These corporations won't commit suicide, so they want to keep as much of their infrastructure active as possible. So they are proposing very dubious uses of hydrogen as a kind of a greenwashing mechanism. To just with considerable dangers. With the leakage of hydrogen, with all the consequences and byproducts in the burning of hydrogen, which includes some toxic chemicals. Can you put your finger on things that are really truly legitimate? What is the niche for hydrogen? Where does it really belong in as part of a smorgasbord of other renewable energy solutions?
I'm not too sure where hydrogen should belong. I guess, like, yeah, when it comes down to it, like, the way I try to approach my thinking around like a lot of these topics is looking at things like a tool and not a disruptive solution, right? Like, we should see it as like an option when it's necessary. Like lithium ion is not only environmentally impactful, it has a lot of emissions associated with it. And so if we find ourselves in places where we are running out of ways to store energy and we need a solution, I want to say that like hydrogen seems viable because of like what it's able to offer, in that it can be stored in like a pressure vessel and it can be used. That being said, like when I say that, it doesn't necessarily mean that I think every single solar energy place should be bringing on hydrogen in order to do this. Like, that is so not the case. But I think like when I think of the tools that I have available to me as an engineer, I think of like, a hammer. I think of like machines. I think of, like the supplies that go into like the processes that I'm designing. And I want to look at hydrogen as a similar way, where it's like there are benefits and there are disadvantages to using it. And taking the data that we know, creating criteria around like what makes it useful or what makes it beneficial, and then evaluating it against like other options and determining whether or not that is like the best solution. To me, that is the right way to make a decision around if hydrogen should be used, and then sourcing it from a green source. To me, that's the best way that we can use it. It's like, see it as that tool, see it as that supply source, but like don't look at it as the new thing that should take over the industry, because that is just like, we do not need we don't need to replace like our current industry. We don't need to disrupt it. We want to add to it. And I think that that's kind of like a new concept within like the innovation that we're like, or I guess like, it's a new concept to like not try to disrupt things, because capitalism kind of requires us to want to disrupt it. It makes us want to take over everything around it so we can eliminate the competition and we can like be the most profitable. But in reality, I think it's important that we view it as a tool, and we try to like use it where it's necessary, but not just paper over everything that's already been done for it.
So there was a question about the pipeline. Is it even possible to make pipelines that where there's really no leakage of hydrogen? I mean, is it from a practical point of view, would hydrogen leakage be doomed to occur?
I really don't know, right? Like I would have to do a lot more research into that question to give you like a true answer. But what I can say is that the risk is high. Like the risk of it leaking, the risk of it being inefficient, there's a high likelihood that this is going to leak. And we need to be aware of that. As far as embrittlement goes, I'm sure that materials could be engineered to prevent embrittlement from occurring. But even if we do something like that, we just creating the new material isn't going to make it a solution. We're going to have to take that new material and we're going to have to replace all of the existing infrastructure that is being used now with that material in order for it to be an effective solution, which means more permits for these gas companies, more sort of like digging into the earth and replacing infrastructure that allows methane to stay in use too. And so that's the issue really, is that even if there were safer mechanisms for transporting this like large scale like hydrogen blend of hydrogen and methane, it's still such a huge infrastructure project, and it's kind of like not what we need right now. Like we need like renewable sources of energy to be funded and to be improved on, and having all that funding go towards replacing existing fuel infrastructure, it's kind of like the antithesis of the like climate movement. Like we're trying to get away from that.
So somebody asked about the dangers of hydrogen something. I mentioned before that it's an indirect greenhouse gas. And the way that works is that hydrogen bonds with oxygen to form a hydroxyl radical, an OH radical. And that slows down the process of decay of methane in the atmosphere. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, 86 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. So it affects the global warming that way. Would you like to make any final comments before we thank you for this presentation?
Well, I appreciate you having me. And yeah, I think like at the end of the day, when new technologies like this come up, and I'm hoping that this is like the last ditch effort of the fuel industry to like try to be a climate solution before ideally they get taken down, is like, does it pass the sniff test? Does this make sense? Like, where does the hydrogen come from? What is that life cycle impact? Like, these are all important questions that we need to be asking when it comes to like new solutions that are being presented to us. And like the same thing could even be said for things like nuclear and sort of like all of the materials that go into like creating renewables. Like there are a lot of questions that we need to be asking when we hear of a new solution on the market. And then like looking into who is fueling that, who is funding that, what is their interest in it. That creates an important narrative around like, why does it get the recognition and the funding that it gets to, and will this actually help things? So in the case of hydrogen, I think innovation wise, it's helpful to see that like innovations are coming down the line for it. But like, as far as how it's been executed on so far, it is majority being created using gray hydrogen methods like methane, steam reformation, coal gasification. And so we still need to be pushing back around hydrogen infrastructure projects because for the most part, we know that those are being funded by oil and gas industry people. So yeah, I appreciate you having me. And if you ever would like to reach out, email me. My email is ash@greenarrow.org. You can also go to our website. And yeah, I appreciate you having me here today. So thank you.